What does Dante's Divine Comedy, the Venetian Arsenal, and a group called the Glenbrook Advanced Concept Institute have in common? How are they connected? And they're connected in a very rambling way. I'm going to give a rambling talk, part of, I suppose, general practice talking. So let's start off with Dante and the Divine Comedy. So in the sort of the very start of the Renaissance, at the end closure of the Middle Ages, there was a Italian poet, and he knew it, and he was in Tuscany. I'm quite sure where Tuscany is. I think it's in northern Italy, up around Venice, that area, Florence, that general area, and there was popes and mysticism, and the Middle Ages was coming to a close, and the Middle Ages was just getting an injection of rediscovering of the classics of Aristotle and stuff like that. So there was classical literature flooding into the Middle Ages, and there was this mystic belief, set of beliefs coming along, and he wrote a series of poems. And they were very structured, very mathematical, and had a lot of science in them. But they were also related to the structure of the church. In a sense, they were a brilliant construct, and this is something I'm going to talk a little bit about. They were a modern model that they could use. So a model is an idea, and you can imagine through the Middle Ages you had the story of Christ, all these separate models. You had the story of the Roman Empire, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the story of the great families in the place. You had the stories of Christ. They weren't all together, and you had these highly abstract view of God in a place like this, and people were struggling to put this into context. And Dante put this into context by actually putting things at various locations on the planet Earth, which made it a lot simpler. Now, I'm not telling the story completely with the full volume, full flavour of what's going on. So if you can imagine the Middle Ages, the muck, the carts, the people on horseback. You can hear the threshing, the plague. The people with the pox, poor peasants going around that place like that. And this person was an Italian intellectual with a great mind, struggling with the ideas. Now, his idea was, his understanding of the planet was definitely a sphere, and the sphere was constrained by crystal spheres. So Aristotle had said that the moon and the sun and various things in the heavens were on these big glass crystal spheres. You could see through them because the moon could get in front of the sun, so it must be see-through, completely see-through. So you've got these set of, like a fishbowl, the sun, and then the earth is there of a certain size, and everything has to fit in places. And so people were saying having a geographical position for God was very important. And that, just to go back a little bit, there's people with the Islamic philosophy, and Muhammad going up to heaven through his 7 ladders. So this geographic idea of a journey, and at this time people would go in for pilgrimages, so you'd go on a holy journey, a spatial journey, but we also a religious journey coming through. So you had these spheres, and so Dante wrote these poems. They're mathematically structured poems in terms of that. There were 3 lines, and the first and third line rhymed, and the second line rhymed with the 5th and 7th going through. So it was this structure of rhyming going through, very, very complex and very beautiful, going through, written in modern Italian. So there's a whole lot of modern things coming through. I should say at this point in time, So the big idea that I can see is that you've got these structures, and from Dante, I'm going to put a period of time, Dante to Galileo. This is a Renaissance science coming up, and the Renaissance science went up to Enlightenment after Galileo went up to the Enlightenment science. But the key thing here is that the intellectual language became common language and also became printed. Dante's Inferno or Dante's Divine Comedy was actually printed so people could read it. So this is a big step up from the original model around the time of Christ, where it wasn't printed, it was by word of mouth, and so you had to have organisations to promulgate the knowledge. At this stage you had organisations and structures. It was sort of a midway between it. And I think nowadays we're at a new, in Australia, at a new place where there's a new type of printing, and the printing is not on paper but it's on silicon, and it's not the ideas being slammed onto some paper. It's nice and still, but the ideas have been put into silicon and they come alive in computers and they can commute. So we're in a new age, and I do think we're at a new juncture. So this is why I'm looking at Dante's Inferno and going forward him. So we've got this very interesting thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about some maths and group theory associated with it, trying to get into the deeper understanding. So in a sense that Dante got some basic geometry and some theology, mashed it together and produced this amazing construct. And I've got the heavens, but it starts off with Dante as a person. It's highly mathematical. He's in the midsection of his life, and he gets in a horse, and with this geometry, once you put the Catholic Church into it, you can put Roman history into it, you can put modern politics, you can put all this into the same geometry. So he meets Virgil, a Roman era pre-Christian, pre-Christ philosopher or poet. So it's poet to poet, poet on poet, that leads them through the 9 circles of hell, going down into the Inferno. Now it's called an Inferno, but the very centre of the Inferno is frozen solid, and you've got the different sins, and so it's sort of like putting Christian theology on a physical chart, but also engaging people because they can actually shrink down and go in this chart. And what happens is that it's got to be in hell, there's got to be space in hell, you've got to talk, and so you go down, and the different circles are hollowed out, and this will come a bit later. And as you go down, it goes down into a basic cone until you get to Satan's level at the very smallest level. And all this time he encounters modern Romans, modern Italians, ancient Romans, figures from mythology. They're all scrambled together and put together, very much like we do in a modern chart, where we put in the same sort of concept all these different things together to allow them to mishmash. Then you've got these practical considerations. If I have hollowed out the earth with all this material, I have to put the spoils somewhere. So I have to put the spoils in the southern hemisphere, and that means I create a continent in the southern hemisphere. Yes, Australia. And it's from 1302 to 1320. He wrote these things. He actually says that the hollowed out earth has created a big southern landmass, which is a belief, and that southern landmass is purgatory. This is this place where you have imperfect life and these sins are processed there. Now he's led by his Virgil into it, then there's this idea, and I sort of can really relate to this. This is a courtly love. That's where you admire someone from afar and you build a construct of this person from afar. I can sort of really relate to that in this modern world where it's all marry, divorce, all this type of stuff. This idea of idolising another person, male or female, and thinking about it and constructing it, using that as a model to go forward. So he meets this broad called Beatrice, who he's admired in real life, and he also meets a lot of his enemies and makes political comment about the different popes and sections, and you have here Charlemagne, the fallout of Charlemagne and the Pope, and the the donation of Constantine. All this amazing story comes out, and so this is all freeze framed into this poem, and so the second book. So the first book is Inferno, Purgatory, and then Paradise. And then Paradise, so you've got Australia there, which is a very important aspect, that Australia was predicted as the spoils of hell, of digging out hell. Satan's got to make hell, or just dump the insides of hell over here, and it forms Australia. Then you have going from the top of Purgatory up through the celestial spheres up to heaven, and so you've got the sins going in and the virtues going out. Very, very geometrical. So very interesting as a model. Coming into this, I promise I will try and discuss some maths. 300 years pass where this percolates and enters in as a model becomes very useful. As say we have COVID-19, the modelling that we're doing in Australia is useful to guide this modelling, which was this be-all, end-all thing. It's complete, you could say, madness, garbage. It's on the same idea of the DC and Marvel universe, but everyone's bought into it, and it's become serious. And Galileo, who is on the cusp of starting to do experiments. Now, it is interesting that in the Divine Comedy of Dante, he starts to talk about experiments, but he's got this setting up there. He's got the geometry and philosophy being placed on geometry, and he's got the idea of doing experiments. The missing part is some mathematics, and mathematics are not in the way that we think of writing down maths. This is mathematical thinking, or pre-mathematical thinking by Galileo. Now, Galileo is very much an ancient thinker. He thinks of that no longer spheres but heliocentric ones, so that's crushed up. But he also thinks that everything must travel in a circle. So if I throw something, it's trying to go in a circle. So if he rolls a ball down a ramp, that will roll forever, but roll in a circle. And Kepler, who's saying, oh look, the elliptical orbits like comets and stuff like that, that they're not circles, and Galileo pooed him off, saying you're pretty mad. So Galileo was structured in there, and you've got to understand that at the Renaissance there weren't universities. There was printing, but they're not beginning to be publication. But the idea is that you had to construct spaces or these structural models for your dialogue to come in. So not only did he have to have a model for how it was, he had to have a model. You had to actually live inside your model. And so this comes up to Galileo's last work called Two New Sciences, and this takes place in a fictionalized place called the Venetian Arsenal. So Venetian Arsenal is a place where lots of machines, heavy engineering comes along, and so it's really a fictionalized place called, it's a fictionalized laboratory, and in that laboratory he can populate it. And so the Divine Comedy was ideally entertainment, and if you go down from the ancients, Plato and everybody else wrote dialogues, and a dialogue was, you would feed a dialogue as a screenplay. They're basically screenplays. So you would have these ancient people come together and they would have discussions, and they would, instead of having written proofs and charts and tables, they would have everyone in the room, the fictional room, agreeing, saying, yes, I understand it. And so if you were outside, you get this feeling, oh, gee whiz, I should perhaps understand it. There was no citation or anything else like that for the support of work. It was people having an idea, and you have the idea, and it's just written there, and people go, I don't understand it. But then you have written around it, you have these fictionalized people saying, it's a great idea, I can see it, but have you thought of this aspect? And it's this great way of going it. So this Venetian arsenal, so arsenal, if you'd say military construction district. Again, there wasn't the distributed factories and transport system. Essentially, if you wanted to build a ship, you had to get the raw materials in, and the ships would be built, and then the ships would be stored one after the other, or there would be no warehousing or logistics and stuff like that. So it was an arsenal. Now, it's really important in that Galileo's book was a sort of scientific reaction trying to step out of Dante's Inferno. So Dante's Inferno had a series of mathematical incongruities, problems with it, and so in Dante's book he had the talk about the scaling laws, and a lot of talk about which can be understood if you. It was a response to Dante's Divine Comedy is there. Now, of course, it's sort of like an angle. Galileo was looking at Dante, and we look at Galileo, and we see him, but we can't see what he's looking at and reacting to. So he has this fictionalized area. Now, there is also another fictionalized thing at the same time, which, like we say, we're up at science, we're looking down at Galileo, but we're looking at from this structure of the Royal Society, scientific institutions, things like the America, for instance. Now, this was not the only piece of fictionalized fiction, religious fiction. There was also a religious fiction by Francis Bacon, who gave us induction. So the one thing missing in Dante is this induction. He, at no point does he think, I'll do a test, I'll prove, I'll expand my knowledge. He was in this discovery, receive knowledge aspect of it. Galileo was beginning to do tests. He was informed by sort of an induction, but not a what do you call it? He wasn't explicitly aware of it, whereas induction was understood by Francis Bacon, and he wrote a book called New Atlantis. Now, this also was a land in the Southern Ocean off South America. There I read it, Australia again. Good on you, Aussie. And this one had a bit of science fiction, I would agree, in terms of not, was it, where alien abduction, the reverse of it, these lights, these flying saucers, not quite, but flying saucers came over, the light came down, and they gave not a Book of Mormon, but another chapter of the Bible, and these people took it there, and then they said, oh, God really wants us to be scientists, and they essentially had this entire scientific institution that this built up, and this theory of science, and everyone did scientific experiments, and this person became shipwrecked, and he had a journey being explained to how New Atlantis works. Now, New Atlantis was popular and became the structure, the lifeblood of the Royal Institution. Take no one's word for it. It was also parodied by Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels. There was a parody of it. So you've got the Royal Institutions and stuff like that, and you've also got Francis Bacon also drew up the charter for a lot of US colonies based on these principles, and also based on these principles you had a whole series of structures which went in to feed the growth of the United States. So you've got these people believing here. Now, the idea here is that you've got these fictionalized things, and dare I say, universities are fiction. The universities are you can't weigh a university. You can't, especially cut a university in half, but it's universities and agreed fiction. And so here comes in the idea of, through all of this, of creating the Glenbrook Advanced Concept Institute, which can gather together and sponsor ideas. One of the things is that we're not used to ideas coming from nowhere. Something about a very good idea, publishing, they can publish it and prove it. It's got to actually go through one of these fictionalized institutes. So what I'm really interested in is that this is a model. This is a model which we dream up, and then we have a model as a structure to answer a few questions, and it's sitting on the shelf, and we start to add more things into it as we come along. So the idea of the Glenbrook Advanced Concept Institute is very much in this vein of constructing a place where an idea can come from a place, and it can be logically cited in this history, and again, from the very much of it, in terms of the Glenbrook Institute is looking in at a world coming to the end of printing as a mode of transport of knowledge. So we had Dante's Hell coming in at the end of oral history. You had a whole lot of oral histories, and it began to be beginning to be fused together in print. Then what's happened now, the next printing revolution is actually printing on silicon. It is actually, silicon is, you print conductors onto silicon and burn them in and build up a book, and the book comes alive. Now this says very much the idea of I have now concepts that I want to give across. So rather than a book, I produce a social robot which talks with you and understands your level of understanding, and gives you not just a random sentence which you have to look at, find your way through. It gives you precisely the information and the level of your understanding to get you through. So that's the next concept. So I just hope this comes through as an interesting video. I've covered a few interesting aspects and talked about a few things like that, and we'll put it up there, and there'll be just one or two few people, I suppose. Michael, Pino, a few, and Chris, and various people associated with the Institute to know where it's coming through and the actual overarching idea behind it. Thanks a lot for listening.